Hello, students. This is Dr. Winkler once again. And once again, this is the World War I class. We're on the verge of putting this puppy to sleep. This should be the last recorded lecture for this semester. I appreciate your willingness to stay with this. I appreciate your willingness to do one more thing for the team. Well, this lecture is kind of taking a lot of loose ends and trying to put them back together as far as the course is concerned. I want to clarify this. I've taught this course numerous times. I've got to review what I'm doing and how I do it, because there's never been a time when I've actually been able to complete the course. And I'm not going to succeed in doing that today. But I do want to take a few loose threads, put them together to make sense of the last part of the course. Remember, last time we were talking about the collapse of the Central Powers, primarily about the collapse of Germany and the signing of the armistice that went into effect in Britain and France time on 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. I want to make sure I made a big deal about this. Germany was beaten in the war. Why making a big deal about that? Because later on, the Nazis in Germany are going to say, we were not beaten. The old Dolchstoß legend, the stab in the back. We were not defeated. Our armies were on foreign soil. We had not been invaded. So why did we collapse? Because there were traitors among us. There were the Bolsheviks, the socialists, but mainly the Jews. Now this is a hard sell, because tens of thousands of Jews died fighting for Germany. A census was actually taken by the Germans in 1916, and they found out that Jews in the military were a larger percentage of Jews were in the military than other segments of German society. Of course, that doesn't matter, because, according to the Nazis anyway, because the Jews, everybody knows, are a bunch of crooks, and everybody knows they really do not have our best interest at heart. Rationalizing, among other factors, why Hitler and the Nazis later on would decide to eradicate all the Jews they could get their hands on. Germany was defeated. Now, the Nazis are going to make propaganda out of this. There are other nationalists in Germany who say the same thing. Germany was defeated. They could not continue. I mean, it would have just been a matter of weeks had the war gone on before foreign armies would have been on German soil. There's a really odd thing happened to me when I was at Utah State University. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my university experiences were not terribly stellar. Jaded professors don't like their topics, don't want to talk about it, don't prepare lectures. But you're at a university and they're offered classes, you have to take what classes are offered, even though sometimes the professors, shall I say, left a lot to be desired. I took this 19th century history class, which went up to 1918. So it technically included First World War. The professor didn't say anything about the First World War. Quite frankly, he didn't say anything about the 19th century in Europe. Just kind of blow it off. But he did say this, I remember. He's indicating that Germany actually really did not lose the war. And I'm going, come on. He said the reason for this is that the German economy right now is better than anybody else's in Europe. Well, this is the 1970s. This is a long time after the war is over. Are we going to read history backwards? Are we going to say that because Germany's economy in the 1970s is relatively robust, and it was, and it still is, it's good economy, that somehow this meant that Germany did not lose the war? I don't care how you view this, Germany loses the war. However, though the fighting in the trenches is over, there's a lot else going on right now. You see, one of the arguments, remember, I made last time as to why Germany was defeated was the blockade. Starving Germany, literally and figuratively, starving Germany for food, but also starving Germany for important natural resources, which it really couldn't get domestically. However, you think, well, the war's over. Let's allow food to come in. No, 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 no. What happens is the blockade continues. Remember, when you put a blockade on your enemy, it's a blockade. If you put a blockade on somebody who's not at war, then it's an embargo. Quibble over terms. U.S. and Britain starved Europe. This is largely from moving food and services by sea. Now, I'm probably being a little bit too negative here on Britain and the United States. And you read British historians, sometimes British historians will acknowledge this, but say, oh, by the way, it's France's fault. How's it France's fault? Well, France is not allowing food transportation to go from France into Germany. Sometimes when they mention this, they forget to mention how, by the way, the naval blockade actually continues. So it's not just the United States and Britain, France is involved as well. Hunger brings unrest, absolutely. We've already talked about this. It brings rebellion. Now, one of the things that your political leaders all over Western Europe are very concerned about, and that is communism. You can call it Bolsheviks and we can call it Marxism if we want to, but it's basically communism. Communism, as you well know, is when the lower classes become restive and they take the means of production away from the industrialists, the people who have actually, according to the industrialists, have created the wealth. But the lower classes say, no, we created the wealth. Why is everybody so concerned about this? We're concerned about this because the upper classes who are controlling the wealth view this as a direct threat to them maintaining their wealth. Communism becomes an ideology of unrest and rebellion because now we have a justification for overthrowing what has already happened, overthrowing those who have, shall we say, hurt us. A lot of times in these various countries, even though they hate their enemies, no doubt about that, they tend to look at the government and the upper classes as part of the problem. Now, if you want to keep this from, remember this is already broken out in Russia, but if you want to keep this from spreading into Central Europe, Germany and Austria, and maybe the fear is that if it goes into Western Europe, it can go into France, it can go into Britain and Italy as well. You see, you probably want to stop it as far east as you possibly can. So can we say the blockade, bringing on unrest, rebellion, and communism, doesn't really do the Western powers a lot of good, because what would happen if Germany and Austria became communist states? That would threaten, shall we say, social and political fabric of Western Europe. Well, let's take a look a little bit more about the blockade. I don't want to repeat a lot of the information that I gave you earlier when we were talking about the blockade in another context. But let's take a look at other aspects of the blockade right now. In March 1918, the war is still going. Remember, Holland, or the Netherlands, if you will, is still neutral. They're a neutral power. But they can, of course, they have a strong boundary with Germany. They can trade with Germany. All neutrals can trade with everybody, right? So Britain decides they're going to grab the merchant marine. This is an act of war. What is the Netherlands going to do about this? They're going to invade? No, they're not. They simply grab the entire merchant marine. The merchant marine is actually a nice word for all of your commercial vessels. The transport goods, the machinery, fertilizer. The idea being that if you can starve Holland, this will help starve Germany. Later on, Britain just simply, remember, they got the United States backing them up as well. They start to seize all neutral vessels. Now, we already mentioned that when the Kaiser ran out of Germany, remember the last few days before the war is over, he's got to get out of town. He might be killed. And he runs to Holland. Why Holland? Not only this, He remains there for the remainder of his life. I believe he dies there in 1941. He's going to live for what, another 23 years? Quite a while. In the meantime, starting really at the end of the war, the Western powers, Britain and France, they want to get a hold of the Kaiser. They want to try him for starting the war. They want to try him for war crimes. And they tell the Netherlands, give him up. And the Netherlands tells them where to jump. Well, why is the Netherlands upset that they won't hand over this supposed war criminal? I think it's pretty obvious. Britain has done a lot of things that doesn't make the Netherlands like him very much, like them very much. The war is still waged by blockade after the armistice. Okay, the fighting's over. So the blockade on Germany continues, and Austria. One book I read said that if you look at the totality of what the Americans, French, and the British are doing at the end of the First World War, they actually have the blockade against a lot of neutral powers. 23 neutral liberated enemy countries. What bothers me about this, I want to see the list. Who are you including? Are you including Austria and Hungary as separate nations? Are you including Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland? I don't know. But unless you're including those kinds of people, in reality, who you block? Who else? I mean, you're running out of countries in Europe. Once again, going back to the idea of placing embargoes on countries. If you inhibit trade into any country that could trade with Germany, then you can inhibit what's happening in Germany. Part of the blockade is to punish Germany. Now, once again, I'm going to make an argument. Is it the German people make the decision to go to war? Yes, they do go to war. They have no choice. You're in a country and they draft you. What do you do? I mean, you can't just say, well, I'm sorry, I don't like my government, therefore on this occasion, I'm not going to support the government. No, you're going to be pressured to do so. Are you wrong just because you were born in the country? Blockade to punish Germany, however. The men who are in government, remember, the Kaiser's hiding out in Holland. Nobody punishes Ludendorff. Nobody punishes Hindenburg. You got to punish the people. Well, Germany is facing rebellion and uprisings and unrest. And it's very, very disturbing for the new civil government, who really had nothing to do with the war. But now the military dictatorship hands the government over to the civilian government, and you end up these people taking the rap for things that they had nothing to do with. This is going to severely hurt the reputation of the new republic of democracy in Germany. We call it the Weimar Republic. Well, what they decide to do is they want to feed their country. This surprised me when I started reading this. They actually had gold for food. Had gold. What, after 4 years of war? All the expenses involved, the trading, you still have gold reserves in Germany? I guess they did. Germany says, we're not asking for a handout. We're not asking for free food. We're asking, we'll pay for it. We'll pay good dollars for it. Just let it come in. But France and Britain decided, well, we're not going to take money for this. We're not allowed to come in at all. One of the reasons why they decide this is they're going to get the gold anyway. And they don't have to trade for it. They're just going to get it. Because in the peace treaty, they're going to make sure that Germany has to pay reparations. And one way they're going to do this in specie, and good, solid silver and gold. So France and Britain are going to get all of Germany's gold anyway. Why trade for it? It's going to be theirs as a gift in literally a matter of months. So Germany's offer to pay good money for this goes nowhere. Many thousands of innocents die. Remember the studies I was telling you about. When historians are clocking the increase in death rates in Germany at the beginning of the war with the blockade. Now, essentially, I said about Depends. Some studies will say a little bit differently. Like 700,000, 750,000 people die because the death rate goes up in Germany between 1914 and 1918. What I do not know is has anybody taken the study into the blockade period after the war and see what the death rates are in those cases. 33% of children suffering from malnutrition diseases. Remember I mentioned earlier that over 20,000 children in Berlin alone are suffering from rickets. Even when these, of course, many of these children will not survive, even those who do survive sometimes have impaired health. When they have impaired health, sometimes they're going to die earlier anyway. I already mentioned about the potential problems with mentality. Can we say that one of the reasons why they're doing this is to punish Germany? No doubt about that at all. But how about forced to sign any peace? Germany will have absolutely no choice. They are going to be pushed so badly that there's going to really be no chance that they possibly not sign a peace. They'll sign anything. So it'll be like the armistice in 1918. Erzberger and the other people negotiating with Foch. Over armistice terms, Berlin says, sign anything. Well, it's the same kind of thing here. Putting the pressure on Germany, Germany has no choice. Herbert Hoover didn't like this. He made a big deal over this in his memoirs. He said he didn't like this during the war, after the war, follow-up. And I like his quote. We do not kick a man in the stomach after we licked him. Okay, you beat him at the war, now he's laying on the ground, now you come up and kick him. Hoover had some pretty severe words to say about this. According to his memoirs, he confronted David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain. And there was a very awkward, shall we say, nature of the conversation. Because according to Hoover, Lloyd George actually said, oh, by the way, you people ought to be doing something. Remember Belgian relief, and remember Hoover's over the U.S. Food Commission the last year of the war. And essentially, Lloyd George said that he's kind of trying to blame Hoover and his people for the continuation of the blockade. Now that's ludicrous. Obviously, Hoover has nothing to do with it. According to Hoover, he popped a literal cork. Now, remember, this man is pretty distinguished. He was raised a Quaker. He's known for his restraint a lot of times when he's speaking. However, before he became a mining engineer, he was a miner. He'd go in the mines in the United States, long shifts, 12-hour shifts, these kind of things. Can we say the language that the men used down there was colorful language? He doesn't say this in his memoirs, but those are the kind of men who know how to use expletives. According to Hoover, he laid him out. He just called him every word he could think of. What you're doing. And Hoover refused to take any blame for that. Now, the problem with this is David Lloyd George was dead by the time that Hoover published his memoirs. And this does not show up in David Lloyd George's account of his war years. Now, if it did really happen, I think something like this happened. Of course, David Lloyd George wouldn't make a big deal over it. Probably wouldn't mention it at all because it makes him look bad. On the other hand, it'd be nice to have a little bit more verification. Germany can't give Britain and France gold to bring in food. Germany says, you won't take our gold with anything else you'll take. Finally, Britain says in March 1919, well, we'll take your merchant marine, all your transport vessels, all your luxury liners. Germany hands it over. Okay, everything we've got. You want them, take them, but give us some food. The difficulty here is, actually, some of these vessels are renamed British names, like the Queen or whatever. They're actually German vessels. But, shall we say, some of the carrying trade Britain would enjoy at the end of the First World War, including luxury liners, came from Germany. So, to get more food into Germany in March 1919, Germany literally surrenders their merchant marine to Britain. more food comes in, but not enough to change things. You see, it's kind of like, well, here, I've taken your money now. What do you get for it? Not enough. The blockade is finally lifted after the treaty was signed. This is the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles signed on the 28th of June, 1919. So a few months, few weeks, actually a few days, a few weeks later. Now food shipments are allowed to come into Germany. See, Britain and France have gotten what they wanted. So 9 months after fighting is over, as Germany continues to suffer, as the innocents continue to suffer and die, you keep the blockade going. A few years later, not that much longer, there's going to be a big nationalist upsurge in Germany, and eventually it kind of focuses on the Nazis. Do you think that Hitler and his ilk, those like him, are going to have a hard time preaching hatred in Germany toward France and Britain? Is that going to be a hard sell? Oh, no. No. That's an easy sell. And why is this? As we look at how Germany was treated at the end of the First World War, and I'm not turning this course into a post-World War I class, but eventually in punishing Germany, at least in world opinion, you're going to start to make Germany the victim. And France and Britain are going to make themselves look even more like the mean guys, the bad boys on the block, the guy who pick on people who can't fight back. Well, I mentioned this earlier, just mention it again and go on. Remember, children with poor nutrition are often brutal. Okay, does that help us explain the Nazis in World War II? I don't know. But I want to throw it out there as a consideration. I've already mentioned this, I'm repeating myself. The fighting in Europe, even though the World War I is over in 1918, there's fighting going on in Europe. There's a civil war in Russia. There is the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's wars between Poland and Russia. People trying to get the best borders they possibly can. And it's a very narrow thing that Poland actually existed, because when the Russians went on offensive against them right after the war, the Russians almost got to Warsaw, almost took the state, before they were eventually defeated and pushed back. The last real combat after the First World War was the Kronstadt Rebellion in 1923. So there's fighting going to go on for years. You see, we don't just call an armistice and everything becomes cool, because there's a lot of pieces, shall we say, that the various people are fighting over, even after the war's over. Well, let's take a look at a few other things. War in the colonies. Yes, this is a world war. I concentrated almost exclusively on Europe. That's where the big fighting is going on. But it is a world war. It's not just fought here. Remember, I mentioned it's fought in Asia. The Japanese grabbing German colonies. The Chinese have actually come in later as well. I don't know what they got out of it. There's a lot of fighting in Africa. We almost forget about this. If you include the privations of the Africans, cut off food supplies, spread of disease, if you include the porters that are helping carry weapons, food, medicines for the warring powers, and they die in large numbers. You see, now we have hundreds of thousands of Africans dying. We almost forget about this in your history books. I mentioned porters. There are so many diseases in Africa that to bring horses, mules, or donkeys to transport your materials, it doesn't work, because the diseases will kill them. Now, I have to be nervous about this. You got diseases that'll kill those animals. They have a lot of resistance. What is that going to do to people? But because you can't use animals to transport your materials. You have to use human beings, and that leaves them more exposed to privation, more exposed to disease themselves. And the porters are local people. These are not Europeans. Forced labor, starvation, disease. The East African campaign starts at the very beginning of the war. Now, it's not my purpose to go through and give you a big discussion of what went on. It is a very, very interesting story. Let's go to Africa in 1914. Get you some maps here. Which is the one that best represents what I'm trying to explain? Does that one work? And not as good as I would like it to, because traditionally we call the British red and the French blue. We've got this backwards, so let's go in this direction. Don't want to mix what colors. Okay, Britain's holdings, red, French holdings in blue. German holdings in this map are in green. The campaign which I would like to see, these are held by Portugal, Germany, German Southwest Africa, German East Africa. I would like to see a little bit stronger coloration to give you a better idea as to national boundaries. This kind of works as well. As you can see what's happening in the colonial empire. Britain's essentially starting in Cape Town, this direction, moving north. Of course, they started Egypt and are moving south, including the Sudan down this direction. Can we say that German East Africa is right in the middle? No doubt about that at all. France is over here. And very importantly for our discussion here, Portugal is in control of these areas. Now remember, Portugal came into the army, came into the war on the side of the Allies. They got pretty upset at Germany's submarine warfare, so they came in. We have an isolated garrison here, led by Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Of all the men who led forces in the First World War, this is the only one that you can actually say was a military genius. As we look at the fighting on the Western Front, there's nobody there we could actually sit down and say, well, this guy is really, really brilliant. No, there's nobody like that. On the Russian front, on the Eastern Front, Brusilov is a very able man. Brusilov is a Russian general whose Brusilov's offensive in 1916 hurt the Austrians badly. But see, while he's clever against the Austrians, and the Austrians don't do well in the war, he's not clever against the Germans. On the other hand, you could look at Ludendorff and Hindenburg on the Eastern Front. Say these are able men. They are, but they're usually German army fighting the Russian army, and the German army is simply superior. So where's our geniuses? They don't exist in Europe. But we have Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. This guy, he has nothing. Okay, he can't get supplies from Germany. He can't get reinforcements from Germany. What was it? He had like 2,000-3,000 Germans there. They're officers. They're also NCOs, non-commissioned officers, also known as sergeants. So can we say they're the leadership? Everybody else, like what, 20,000 men, 30,000 men that he has there are in fact native Africans. Now, can you imagine that these Africans, that they're soldiers and they're porters, what loyalty do they feel to Germany? Very little. So Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck is simply got to somehow get their loyalty, somehow get their discipline. Remember, how easy would it be for these guys to leave? You get fed up. There's a big area out there. Just kind of walk away. He's got to keep everything together. To do that is quite remarkable. But there are hundreds of thousands of Allied forces, remember, led by Europeans, but largely African combat troops that are trying to get him. He has like one artillery piece. There's a German ship over here. They really can't use it. So before Leto Vorbeck decided that he was trying to keep going here. They pulled a gun off the deck of this thing. He can't get supplies and ammunition from Germany. Where is he going to get them from? He's going to have to get them from the enemy. He's going to have to stage raids. He's going to have to understand the topography. He's going to have to understand the people. He's going to have to be on the move. Let's get him up here. Let's get him up here. Regular old German gentleman. It's a little bit later in life. Remember I mentioned the Australians? They like to take their caps and have one side up. Well, of course, that's probably fashionable for him as well. Okay. When he came back at the end of the First World War, he is met with a great deal of adulation, a lot of high praise. Well, you read the accounts of his battles. He's got to get personal control of what's going on when he's fighting the enemy. He knows when to engage. He knows when to disengage. He knows when to move. He knows where to move, how to move. And when he's engaged in battle, he's got on a bicycle. I don't know why I think this is silly. I guess it's not at all. But he gets on his bicycle and he's running up and down the lines. Running up and down the lines, yelling orders, what shall you do? So he's actually in control of combat. It's not one of these guys who has a plan that he sets out in front of somebody and says, go figure it out. No. He's a very much hands-on leader. Everything, he's maneuvering, of course, within German East Africa. But he realizes he's too inhibited by that. So he slips across the border at various times, down these areas that are controlled by Portugal. Remember, Portugal is an enemy of Germany. So he goes down here, and of course the Portuguese are after him down here. The British are after him. He slips over into various areas. He's always on the move. They never get him. The war starts out in August 1914. In November 1914, they hear the information comes down that there's been an armistice. This is what, the 14th, several days after the armistice was actually signed. Now you're going to believe this could be a rumor. So Leto Vorbeck and his adversaries, they have a ceasefire, not an armistice, to make sure this is verified. A week or two later, it is verified. This is accurate. The armistice has been signed. The war is over. So Leto Vorbeck now says, okay, it's over. And he goes home. We can only speculate. We can only speculate. But in reality, it would have been really nice to know what he could have done on the Western Front. But we will never know. But we do have a bona fide military genius in the First World War. Now, my admiration for him is quite remarkable, actually. I say, how did you possibly pull this off? What kind of genius are you anyway? It goes back to Germany. I already showed you the parades, and are there any heroes in the war? Well, he's one of them. Germany has very little to brag about, obviously. I have other admiration for him. Of course, he's going to be in Germany when the Nazis come to power. This man has prestige, he has military ability. Now, by the late 1930s, he's no longer a young man. The youth and vigor is probably out the window by this time frame. However, Hitler would like to use him in the Wehrmacht, in the German army. You can put him in there. He's good for prestige. It's good. Even if he doesn't have much ability anymore, too old to do it or whatever, his prestige in having a military position is in reality probably something that would do the Nazis and the German war effort some good. I would like to see the exact words Leto Vorbeck used. Can we say that he also knew very earthy language? And he told Hitler what he could do with it. Told him to go to infernal regions, among other places. Told him he could kiss his derriere. Now, because he was so prestigious, because he was a military genius, shall we say. The Germans liked him very much. Hitler would not retaliate. But at least Lettow Vorbeck refused to become a Nazi, refused to become involved in the Second World War. In the last few decades, we have seen increased problems in the Middle East. The Middle East has been politically and religiously unstable for a very lengthy period of time, going back hundreds of years, many hundreds of years in some cases. And can we say that the First World War contributes remarkably to the modern issues we have in the Middle East, including fundamentalist groups that like to hate the West and hate the great Satan? Well, World War I contributes to this feeling of hatred. Now, it's not, we don't have time. It's not my intention to go into big discussion of the war in the Middle East. It would be interesting. I don't have time to do that. Well, the siege of Kut, the British are going into what you and I would call Iraq, which is controlled by Turkey. And they get in too far and they get cut off and they're forced to surrender. Big British humiliation. The Arab revolt against Turkey. Remember I showed you a map of Turkey, and Turkey includes all the Arabic Peninsula, including Mecca and Medina, very important religious sites for Muslims. And the Arab revolts, including the Bedouins, the guys who live out on their camels out in the middle of the desert, more or less. And of course, the British are going to sell them out. They promise these people their own government, their own political entity, their own political expression. Of course, at the end of the war, British have no intention of following up on that. Some of the bitterness is felt in the Middle East today against European powers, and by extension against the United States, goes back to this kind of treason. They sold them out. So the Arabs die in large numbers to defeat Turkey, with the promise they'll be able to govern themselves, and that promise proves to be an illusion. One man that is worth mentioning, Thomas Edward Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, something of a linguistic genius. They made a motion picture called Lawrence of Arabia back in the 60s. Extremely good World War I movie. All kinds of interesting aspects they show about the Arab Revolt and how you fought that war and how you marched. And one of the, I keep saying that wrong. One of the things that I think is so brilliant about this motion picture is they actually show his decline into insanity. And yes, by the end of the war, this man is shell-shocked. He's suffering very badly. He was made because the American press got a hold of him. He was made into such an important person. In fact, a news reporter by the name of Lowell Thomas, a young American newspaper reporter, which was very famous in my generation, I remember him quite well. He made a lot of hay over him. He'd have these little slideshows. He went and met Lawrence and took photographs. He'd go around places, including Britain, and you'd make this big show about what he did. What he did was most impressive. But now people are hounding him. They want to shake his hand. He hid out to try to get his sanity back. And I'm not sure he ever got it fully back. But to get his sanity back, he actually joined the military under an assumed name. This he's got head wounds, he's got wounds on his body. He was whipped when he was captured at one time frame. And somehow he was able to pass the physical and take his mental problems into the barracks. Fascinating character. Very good with languages. Before, one thing there's a lot of distortions in the motion picture, but one of the things about Lawrence of Arabia, they don't show that he had spent 4 years in the Middle East, so he could speak Arabic very, very well. And that gave him the opportunity to be more influential as a brilliant leader. He wrote a book called The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. I've tried to read it several times. I can't get very far. Why use one word when you can use 10? There might be some artistic merit to the way he was writing, but I want to read something that's a little bit easier to understand. So I have read a shortened version of that called Revolt in the Desert. Gives you some good insights into this brilliant man. He was killed in a motorcycle accident in 1935. Well, one other thing, the British are doing everything they can to get anybody to support them anywhere. So the Balfour Declaration comes out in 1917, offering the Jews a homeland in Palestine, homeland in Israel, if they will just fight for the excuse me, they'll fight for the Allies. This becomes a big deal when you get into your Holocaust studies, because the Zionists, the Jews that want to go back to Palestine to establish a homeland, they've got this to hold on to. Okay, Arabs betrayed by the mandate. At the end of the First World War, we have what we call mandates. In reality, what a mandate means is you just simply divide up conquered areas for the good of the victors. So France and Britain divide up the Middle East. Britain gets Iraq, Palestine, Jordan. France gets Syria, Lebanon, and part of Turkey. In other words, can we say the Arabs are betrayed? It's a small word, yes, they're betrayed, big time. Now, can we go back to Africa? Everyone in Africa wants peace. German Southwest Africa goes to South Africa. Belgium is upset because they wanted a bigger chunk over here. Remember, Belgium controls the Congo. There is some compensation, which is given to the Portuguese. Remember, the Portuguese involved in the war, so they get a slice over here. The British and French take this. So you're just dividing up the spoils, aren't you? Of course, I already mentioned Japan grabbing land, islands, a lot of water in the Pacific. How does this make you look? If you went to war to try to defend the honor of Belgium, to try to make sure that Belgium's still in the war, and then at the end of the war, you just simply ignore every high ideal you can think of and simply divide up the spoils among yourself, it's almost easy to say that while Britain says they went to war to defend Belgium, in reality, what Britain really wants at the end of the war is what they get, an expansion of the empire, occupying more peoples, taking over more areas. You can see all this leads to bitterness among the Muslim population that actually even comes down to us today. Well, let's skip the German Revolution. A lot going on here. And let me just say a few things if I have enough time. Give myself a time check. Okay, got a little bit of time. So let me talk a little bit about the Peace of Paris. It's a flawed peace. It's a bad peace. I mentioned in other contexts earlier on, one of the reasons why this is going to be a bad peace is that there's so much bitterness in the war, and there was so much preaching to the people in France and Britain and Italy that we're going to get those doggone Germans and the Austrians for all the doggone things they did to us. And so it's going to be very, very difficult politically for them to back off on that. But they really didn't want to. Political leader says, well, let's stick it to them. You see, another idea here is if you stick it to them and treat them very badly, remember, we are making a statement, are we not? They deserve it. So they're wrong in all cases. Well, Wilson, the high and mighty American, brilliant intellectual man, comes over from the United States. It's his chance to remake the world. Boy, if you want to feed your ego, that's a good way of doing it. A brilliant American politician, political scientist, historian. Does he really understand what's going on in Europe and other parts of the world? No, he is not. He's naive and he's inexperienced. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, George Clemenceau, the President of France, disrespect him. Is that a correct word? They call him a horse's rear end, among other things, behind his back. What an absolute piece of junk. Does not understand. Bad peace. Punish the vanquished. When you punish the vanquished, you do have a tendency to set yourself up for revenge. If you want to sit down and make a peace, that everybody has the opportunity or the willingness or desire to keep the peace, that might be a better idea. But however, to punish the enemy, do they really have in their vested interest an idea of why they want to maintain the peace agreement? Or do you have them thinking that the peace agreement is so bad, anything we can do to break it down is in our best interest? Punish the vanquished, a bitter, resentful Germany as the victim? Sure, that's what happens. France wants security and increased empire. Well, they get it in Africa. They get it in the Middle East. They want security. Push back Germany's boundaries, take Alsace-Lorraine back, and make sure that Germany has to pay, keep Germany impoverished by paying the French large amounts of money, reparations. And also making sure they cannot have military forces in the Rhineland, and there was no military forces can face the borders of France. And then have a military that's so small it's almost a joke. What Britain wants, well, peace and empire, they get that. Now, there are different treaties for different countries. There's different treaties for Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Turkey. Remember, these are the defeated powers. Because these are defeated powers, you don't really have one peace that encompasses everything. Going back to what we're discussing right here, we almost forget these other things because the Treaty of Versailles is the biggest one. The Peace of Paris, 1919. The one that we remember is the Treaty of Versailles, which is signed on the June 28th, 1919, which happens to be the anniversary of the assassination, 5 years to the day, of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which got the ball rolling, which led to the war. Could have been signed on any other day, but it has to be, shall we say, somewhat symbolic. The various agreements here with these countries, and it takes a long time to negotiate all of these. Can we say that what they're named after are the various suburbs of Paris? That's why we call it the Peace of Paris. It's in and around Paris. Versailles, the old palace of Louis XIV, had been outside of Paris a number of miles before this time frame. Paris is a pretty good city by this time. Paris had grown out to incorporate Versailles. In other words, it's another suburb, being a very famous palace. So what we have here is the Treaty of Versailles. Can we say this is irresponsible? Loses territories. France actually wanted to go and simply dismember Germany. Just simply, okay, need a map. France wants to dismember Germany. We'll just come in and create several states. Obviously, Germany being together has a lot more strength, manpower, has a lot more strength in industry. But you can divide it up, then it's weak. So why didn't they do this? The argument is this, that, well, if you divide up Germany into various states, and one of the things they're going to want to do is reunite. And as they try to reunite, that gives them less of a desire, shall we say, to keep the treaty. So rather than causing instability in Germany, they decide, we'll leave it largely intact, but we'll take everything we can away from it. Let's look at what they do. Now, you want a Poland here. You want Poland didn't exist before the First World War. Remember, I said in the fighting that happens to be around at the end of the First World War, there's a question about what will the boundaries between Russia and Poland be. And of course, Russia wants as much land as they can have. The Poles want as much as they can have. So there's a lot of fighting here until 1921, where the boundaries of Poland are actually established, at least on the eastern part. What does Poland want? Well, Poland, remember, was not a state that was actually involved in the war because it didn't exist. But Poland, shall we say, should be given a lot of deference. Well, Poland doesn't want to be landlocked. They want to have the ability to trade. So we have the city of Danzig up here. The name has changed to Gdansk now, but it's Danzig at that time. So the Poles want to have this as a port. But however, we have to have access to the port. So all this section of Germany, you give it to Poland. About 90% of the people live here are Germans. There is a small Polish minority. That doesn't matter. You simply give it to Poland. The problem about Danzig becomes challenging because the Germans say they need it as well in the Baltic over there. So actually, Danzig is not kept part of Germany. It's not formally part of Poland either. It's like a free city. And I don't know how you possibly negotiate that kind of thing. But in reality, what we have is you simply have a free city. Now, this is very awkward to say the least. But at least since it's not controlled by Germany, Poland can say we have enough influence so we can keep trading. But remember, any idea of national determination, of people going where their language and ethnicity would normally dictate, this is out the window. Now, something else the Poles want is coal reserves to run your heavy industry. You need a lot of coal. You can buy the iron ore from Sweden or other places where you can get it. But you got to have coal. You got to have coal nearby. So this little, see this right, this little area right here in Lower Silesia is given to Poland. Now, 3/4 of the people who live there are Germans. There's a small Polish minority. But once again, who cares about nationalities and self-determination? If somebody wants a piece of Germany, they've got it. One of the things I find so very amusing right here, notice that they give a chunk of Germany to Denmark. Denmark was not even involved in the war. Denmark was not attacked. Denmark didn't fight the Germans. So reward them for what? We reward them simply because we want to punish Germany. Going over to the map, is that big enough? Can you see that well enough? It's better than the one I just tried to pull up. Okay, the Rhineland, this area over here, has to be completely demilitarized. Alsace-Lorraine right here goes back to France. No doubt about that. Can you see this little piece right here? Little bitty piece right there. Remember, Britain goes to war to make sure that Belgium is where it ought to be. But you got to reward Belgium for having been attacked. So give them a piece of Germany. Virtually no Belgians live there. This is entirely German speaking. So you give, it's still there. It's still German speaking. And it's still part of Belgium. There's going to be military occupation of this for a number of years. The Saarland, which is right over here, has a lot of coal reserves. And the coal reserves, France wants them to help rebuild their economy. They've got iron, but they need more coal. So for 15 years until 1934, the Saarland is going to be occupied by France. And they're going to be able to use German coal to run their industry. In 1934, right after the Nazis came to power, excuse me, I said that wrong. There's going to be a plebiscite held in the Saarland. And these people are going to decide if they want to be part of France or part of Germany. Well, they voted to be part of Germany. Once again, when I was at Utah State, A professor, this is a geography professor, said, the logical boundary between France and Germany is the Rhine River. Really? Because the people over here are really more French than they are German. Really? That's ridiculous. These people down here have the opportunity to be part of France, and they don't want to be part of France. They want to be part of Germany. This is German. And if a few people there speak French or not, this is German. Remember, this area cannot be occupied militarily. So Germany cannot defend its western border. If Belgium or France want to invade, and they do, in 1923, there's no war because the Germans cannot resist. But you leave a country that's literally wide open for invasion. Now, the issue in 1923, when Belgium and France did invade Germany, was the Germans were not paying their reparations at least as fast as the French and the Belgians would like them to. So they came in and grabbed German industry. How does this make you feel in Germany? Of course, it ruins the German economy. They literally come in, the Belgians and the French literally come in and go in the mines and the factories, literally at gunpoint, tell the Germans, you're going to produce or we'll kill you. The Germans sit down in the mines, do nothing. They sit down in the factories and do nothing. You see, over time, when the heat of the war mellows out somewhat, now you're turning Germany into the victim. So there's really big problems here. Loses territories, must disarm, can't have an air force anymore. They can't have submarines, but they're allowed to have a small surface navy. The 100,000 man army. This is so small that almost every nation facing Germany, including Austria, Switzerland, Czechoslovakia, even Holland and Denmark, have a larger army than Germany has. If we say it's really not an army that's capable of defending the borders, it cannot do that. It's also, shall we say, just something of a police force. That if we have rebellions taking place in Germany, they could probably put it down. And of course, the Allies want this to happen, at least have that much of a force to keep the Bolsheviks, so we say communists, the socialists, coming to power in Germany. The Allies don't want to have this as a mechanism where you simply go in and train people. You see, if you have a 100,000 man army and you simply go in there and let's make up a year or two, and you trade them. So in 10 years, you could have a 500,000 or a million men trained. They don't want to have this as an apparatus to train the German army. So the recruitment has to be for 12 years. Now, if you're in a bad situation, and a lot of men don't like the military, you go in because you need a job and you're stuck there for 12 years. That can be tough. And in any event, suicide becomes an out for some of these men. However, of course, what Germany's going to do is they're going to train these 100,000 men to be officers. Any corporal in the German army could be a captain in any of the army of the world. Military occupation for years. Demilitarized Germany. Okay, I said that wrong. Demilitarized Rhineland, you cannot have troops over here at all. Guilt clause and reparations. You got to make sure that we realize that the Germans are completely responsible. Everybody's responsible, not just the government, not just the military, but everybody's responsible. So the guilt clause, very famous guilt clause, essentially says this. Everybody in Germany is responsible for the war and everything that happened in it. As a responsibility for this, then your responsibility for compensation, your responsibility to pay, you're responsible for reparations. I remember reading a German's autobiography. He was a child this time frame. And he said, now here I am in Germany, and suddenly I'm guilty of war, and I'm a child. See, why do you need this? Well, you want to make a statement, don't you? After all, the Germans are awful. Another issue here is, once again, you can be forced to pay. Now, the guilt clause by implication says a lot more than just what we're talking about here. It's just people that are alive at that time frame. Because they're saying generations unborn. Can I repeat that? Generations unborn somehow inherit this guilt. So people that were born well after the war are still responsible to pay for the war. The idea is to impoverish Germany for generations. Of course, France wants to benefit quite a bit from this. Now, I was quite shocked a number of years ago. I thought I had a brief handle on this. I thought I had a pretty good idea of what had happened. Remember, Belgium and France invaded in 1923. The discussion at that time was, can we ameliorate the amount of money that's being paid? And so they put another payment schedule on it, which is a little bit easier on the Germans. In the late 1920s, money from the United States, easy money policy from the United States, are giving heavy loans to Germany at such an advantageous interest rate and paying over such a lengthy period of time. It's almost free money. A lot of the reparations in the late 1920s actually come from the United States to Germany, and Germany gives it to France. The German economy actually does fairly well in the 1920s, largely fed by US money. But when we have a financial crisis, starting in 1929 with the stock market crash, then the easy money from the United States disappears. It's necessary in 1932 to renegotiate the payment schedule coming from Germany. And in doing so, that's about as far as I ever get in the book, because the Nazis come by a year later and go, we ain't paying you nothing. I thought it disappeared. I literally thought that it was something that was no longer legal debt. We forgot about it. But then you start reading newspapers. I was shocked, 2010, a few years ago. I was shocked. Germany made its last payment. What? That's a long time. It's 90 years after the war is over. That's a long time. I would like to find a study on this which would trace this down, because then I'd understand better. But apparently Germany, and at the end of the Second World War, Germany started paying compensation to an awful lot of people, including Jewish families that had been severely, been killed. It's not that they're paying for everybody and everything, but Germany, feeling pretty guilty, doing well economically, started paying money to various peoples. Is this when this was re-examined? Did they come back and do this again? The amount was actually a huge amount of money at the time. Whatever, I don't know if Germany paid this off at a bank or whatever, but the last payment was made in October 2010. Let me take a brief look at some other examples here. Let me give you an idea of Austria-Hungary. Can we say 1919? Will that give us a map of what they did at Austria at the end of the war? What we have is an ethnic map here. I want to pull out the idea that Austria did not want to exist as a country. They actually want to be part of Germany. Of course, France isn't going to allow this, because one thing they don't need is more Germans in a German state. I wanted to show you, these ethnic maps are really fun, but I wanted to show you the division, how this is broken up. If this doesn't work, I'll give up in a minute. Yeah, here we're back to our ethnic maps again. Is that helpful? Okay, that works a little bit. Austria's created almost entirely German-speaking. The Magyars, there's a lot of Magyars, German-speaking people in Romania, German-speaking people in the Sudetenland up here. So Czechoslovakia is created. There's a lot of Hungarian-speaking peoples up in this area. So everybody's taking a piece out of her. Czechoslovakia, can we say, took a little bit more than it probably should have? Romania got a big, big swath here. And remember Yugoslavia. Remember the Serbians are down here. What they want is the greater Slavic area. So they got Bosnia and they got Croatia. As you probably know, after the Cold War, these areas have fallen apart. And Yugoslavia is broken up into several states. The Russians take a piece out of Czechoslovakia over here at the end of the Second World War. And now Czechoslovakia is broken up between the Czechs and the Slovaks. So there's problems going on even very recently about these kinds of things. But why am I making a big deal about this? This was an economic entity. It was part of the Austrian Empire. They had the same civil service. They had the same coinage. And you could trade very easily within inside of this. When you have these new nations, now you have different coinage. And they have trade agreements, in other words, trade barriers and tariffs placed between themselves and other nations. The Rhine still exists today very strongly as perhaps the most important single economic waterway in the world that goes right up here. The Danube was very important, not as important as the Rhine. The Danube starts in southern Germany, and it goes down through Vienna, and it goes down through here, goes down all the way out to the Black Sea. Very important economic waterway, but now is no longer an economic waterway like it was before because all these barriers have come up. With the British delegation at Paris in 1919 is one of the more well-received economists in the early 20th century, a man by the name of John Maynard Keynes. Great economist, yes, very important. He wrote a book, easy read, wrote it really fast, sit down and read it in the afternoon. Economic Consequences of Peace. He's saying it is an absolute disaster what's going to happen economically. These kind of things I was talking about. The Danube is no longer in a place where it's easy to trade. Is no longer, you're going to have the same coinage. You're going to have all these trade restrictions. He was quite right in foreseeing this because it happened. So rather than being economically viable, a lot of times these areas are economically hurting. Perhaps his biggest single criticism of the treaty was the payment of reparations. You see, you can look at France over here and say, oh, by the way, France is getting all this good stuff from this. That's not quite true. Yeah, Germany's paying for wounded veterans. Germany's paying for physical destruction. Germany's rebuilding roads and bridges and telegraph poles, all these kind of things. You say, wow, that benefits France. Not entirely. Because if Germany is producing all of these things and sending them over to France, what's happening to the French economy? The French economy that makes telegraph poles, for example, is killed because they can't compete with free. You see the kind of problems we're going to have here. Keynes is saying, in reality, this doesn't really help France, particularly not in the long run. This is going to hurt France. The best thing, according to Keynes, that can possibly happen is to do away with the reparations and to stimulate the economy of Europe. The only nation that has money that could possibly do that is the United States. And he appeals to the United States in print, shall we say. Let's pump a lot of money into Europe. Let's make Europe economically viable. Let's jumpstart the economy. Rather than everybody being devastated by the war, let's build it up and let's fix it. Now, to defend the honor of the United States, and I do want to do this, the United States, remember, in this easy money, almost free money, does actually help. But the economic stimulus, which Keynes wanted, was not forthcoming until the Marshall Plan in 1948. When the Marshall Plan now pumps huge amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars, into the European economy, which gave the European economy the opportunity to recover from the Second World War. As a nation, I think that's one of the brightest things we've ever done. Could we have done it in the early 1920s? We could have, we had the ability, but people weren't reading Keynes carefully enough. Keynes was right in another respect. When the economies go bad, you have political instability. of all of these, we have all these new countries here. In the interwar years between World War I and World War II, each one of them sunk into dictatorship. The only exception is Czechoslovakia. Germany, Austria, all these other areas become dictatorships. One of the reasons was they're not economically viable. People get desperate and powerful people take over. And I'm going to argue always that democracy is one of the best forms of government that you can possibly have out there. Could it have worked? Yes. This is not the only example of a bad peace in world history. But it does not help with all of these major problems. Well, I'm not going to blame France and Germany, France and Britain for the Second World War. There's a lot of other factors involved. But being politically and economically unstable and clearly is going to cause some problems in Central Europe. And it's not terribly surprising that one of the directions it went was to get some idiot like Hitler running a government. Well, I'm virtually out of time. I pretty well knocked out most of what I want to say. The League of Nations, I don't have time. The League of Nations, let me say this, however. Wilson gave up on all of his ideals, everything but the League of Nations. And the League of Nations the United States did not join. We say that made it weaker. We tried again at the end of the Second World War. The United Nations, that didn't work either. Anyway, let me say one other thing about the war and then I'll let you go. So what is our take on the First World War? Let me go back and repeat some of the things I said the first lecture. Let's understand what war is. Let's understand what war can do. Let's try to understand how awful it is. Remember, I'm not a pacifist. There are very good reasons to go to war. World War II is an example of this, where you can go to war for more reasons against a really awful enemy. But anytime you are going to war, anytime you're going to war, please understand what's involved. Please understand the cost in every level of society, from the loss of men to the millions and millions of women who can't find anybody to marry, who literally cannot have that opportunity in their lives, to social changes. And another appeal I want to give to you. I appeal to you as historians. Whatever your issues might be. I published on the Indian Wars and I'm defending the Indians. I published on the persecution of the Jews in the Middle Ages. I'm trying to defend the Jews when injustices were done to them. I'm trying to keep within the mentality of the few people who might read my articles a statement that justice needs to be done, no matter how belatedly. Please, as historians, whatever you say, whatever you write, please think in terms of justice. Please think in terms of the right things to say to help us understand the past, to make better decisions in the future. Let me end with this. I like to make a joke. My favorite word is free, and my next favorite word is peace. I said that wrong, blew my own point. My favorite word is free, my next favorite word is cheap. That's my economic. However, my real favorite word is peace. When you've been to war, you'll never disparage peace. And please make that a point. If you can possibly have peace, do so. This is lecture 29. I'm Dr. Winkler. You stayed with this course. You have my respect for sticking it out. You'll do well in the final, I have no doubt. And I hope to see you again sometime. Goodbye.